Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Food Industry Podcast brings together journalists and experts to discuss the latest stories in the world of food and beverages.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Xtalks Food Podcast. I'm Sydney Perlmutter, Senior Food Industry Journalist and Webinar Moderator at Xtalks.com. And this week, I'm joined by special guest Annie Simmons. Annie is a field application scientist at Neogen, which is an international food safety company that provides test kits and relevant products to detect dangerous substances in food. So, Annie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. Well, I'll just jump right in. So can you share your educational background and professional journey that led you to sort of specialize in the food safety testing industry?
I went to school at Minnesota State University in Mankato. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in microbiology. And my first job out of college, I applied for a 3M food safety sales position. And I interviewed, and at the end of the interview process, they said, sorry, you didn't get the job. And basically, it just came down to the fact that I didn't have any sales experience. So after the interview, though, they did say that, we did like you so much and you have a great technical background. So we're going to actually create a new job position for you. So they created, basically, it was an internal technical support role for their food safety customers to reach someone with technical questions. And then after about 2 years of that role, I got a promotion and I worked into field service. And I covered a territory about half of the U.S. And I would travel and train to food processing plants and beverage plants as well. I would provide on-site training and evaluation of that method with their particular foods. And I would train their technicians, and then I would offer ongoing technical training and support for them as well. I then ventured into a more specialized role. So that's what led me into the field application scientist role for Neogen Petrifilm plates. I've always loved working with Petrifilm, training on Petrifilm, helping customers adopt Petrifilm, and it's always been kind of my product choice to do educational events and training with. So
that's an awesome journey. I appreciate that. And you're definitely experienced enough to answer my next question, which is with, all the shifting consumer demands and the increasing sort of complexity of the food supply chain, how has food safety testing evolved over the years, and what are some of the major challenges that it faces today? And then on top of that, how is Neogen addressing these challenges?
I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen in the past few decades is proactive testing versus reactive testing. So back in the day, food processors would manufacture food, and then before they release it, they would test it. And in that moment, they would determine, okay, it's good for consumer consumption, or we have to scrap it. But that put them in a very reactive position, right? So nowadays, food processors have become much more proactive at testing. Sometimes they actually perform audits on their raw material suppliers. They are also testing all of their incoming raw materials before they begin processing them. They have increased substantially their environmental monitoring program with pathogens, indicators, allergens, and ATP. They test before cleaning, after cleaning, post-sanitization. They also pull in-process samples where they'll randomly go and they'll pull samples in production, and they'll test what they call in-process samples to make sure that, there's no red flags throughout the processing and the production of their products. And then they test, finally, they test the finished product as well. So as you can see, what I described has substantially increased over the last decades. And overall, the amount of testing they perform in today's food processing environment compared to 10, 20 years ago is tremendously higher. So, and the second part of your question, Neogen is helping the food processors in the industry overcome these challenges by developing test methods that deliver on efficiency, accuracy, and time to result. So an example would be our Petrifilm plate portfolio. A lot of food processors will, in the olden days, would use traditional agar, and they would have to make this agar in-house, which is time consuming, it's laborious, and it costs a lot of money, and it requires a lot of energy to be running an autoclave nonstop and to be paying a lab technician to be making media day in and day out. And so Petrifilm has really revolutionized the lab testing environment by enabling food processors to focus their time and efforts on testing their food versus preparing media to test their food. We also have developed an automated reader, because if you've ever spent time counting plates in a laboratory, I was just counting plates today in our lab, and I spent about 2 hours doing that process. And so we have developed a automated Petrifilm plate reader advance to completely eliminate that step for a lab technician to sit there and have to count plates for hours on end. So Petrifilm is not only helping food labs become more efficient in their testing processes, but it's also as accurate as the standards. And accuracy is usually proven through third-party organizations through validations, right? And one of the major organizations that we obtain validations through is going to be AOAC, Microval, and AFNOR. And so Petrifilm has the most validations of any dry film on the market, and it has over 105 global validations, recognitions, and certificates. And it just proves that validations are a way to prove that a method is reproducible, but also as accurate as the standard way of testing, which is often the traditional agar method. And the reason why food processors adopt these dry film methods to begin with is because they're often more efficient, but they also are faster time to results. So if you can imagine food processors like in the dairy industry and in the produce industry, they're running up on shelf life, right? The shelf life of their product is often short, and taking 2 to 3 to 4 days away from their product shelf life for laboratory testing is money out of their pockets. So we want to make sure that we're delivering speed, but without compromising on accuracy when we develop new test methods. And Petrifilm has proven to deliver on all 3 of those categories.
So in addition to, accuracy, speed, and user-friendly testing methods, how does this efficient testing contribute to supply chain sustainability by helping to reduce waste, optimizing processes, and minimizing contamination risks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I talk about sustainability in the food testing world, I look at 2 different sectors. I look at the test method sustainability. So that's one thing that's commonly overlooked when you look at the sustainability journey of foods. Oftentimes the test methods are overlooked. And so we are constantly looking at ways of how can our test methods enable our food processors to be more sustainable. And one example of an area that has completely changed or revolutionized the food testing industry is the invention of the dry film plate, which is the Petrifilm. So Petrifilm plates have completely eliminated the steps in order to make traditional agar methods in-house. And if you think about the amount of water required to run an autoclave all day, if you look at the energy consumption required to run an autoclave, if you look at plastic and overall media, it enables our food processors to achieve new sustainable means of testing their products.
And as traceability and transparency become more important for food companies themselves, how can these advanced testing and monitoring methods enhance traceability from farm to fork?
So automation and digitizing of data has become key in enabling food processors to record and display testing results. If you think about it, 10, 15 years ago, you would go visit customers and you would see they have all of their results recorded in a little laboratory notebook. And the only person that had access to that lab notebook was oftentimes the lab managers. And now everything is housed on a server with multiple users being able to access that information. And it allows them to become audit ready. And it also allows them to be able to trace back or track lab results. Oftentimes nowadays, they'll integrate what they call a LIM system, which stands for Laboratory Information Management System. And it basically houses all of their lab results from all of their different systems that they're running. So implementing methods that are compatible or customizable so that it enables them to communicate with their LIM system is also something that they're looking as a more efficient way to track and enter in results.
Now, if you were advising a new food processor, which I'm sure you do all the time, where would you recommend that they start with testing their food and the environment?
Yeah, so this is tricky because when you work with large food processors, they have the money and the resources to hire consulting companies or microbiologists to run and operate a lab, right? So it's often the little guys or the smaller food processors that need a little bit more hand-holding and a little bit more assistance with this. And oftentimes they are reaching out to, companies like us, the method developers, because often we work very closely with the food regulators, but we're also very in tune to what other food processors in the industry are doing. And in a way, we become like a consulting role for them. And so they really do lean on method development companies for a lot of information. Oftentimes, they're asking us what to test, how often to test, what methods to implement. We are training and teaching them, bringing them on this learning curve and helping them understand what the food regulations are. And I think the first thing that any food processor should look at is their testing volume. So if they have a sufficient testing volume to start an in-house lab, oftentimes they will build their own internal laboratory. But if they're only testing, 1 to 2 tests a week, obviously the investment of building an in-house lab isn't there. So they should continue outsourcing with confidence and using those ISO accredited third-party testing laboratories. But if they do have a sufficient amount of testing volume, that's one way that they can save a lot of money is by building an in-house lab. And sometimes we've seen customers do like a hybrid situation where they don't want to bring the risk of like pathogen testing in-house. So they'll continue to send out for pathogens, but they do feel comfortable bringing in testing like indicators or ATP. So they'll do like a hybrid situation where they will test those organisms. They'll build like a BSL or a biosafety level 1 lab, and they'll continue sending out for pathogens. So the first thing that they want to look at is their volume. How many tests per week are they running, and calculate basically if the testing volume is there. And they can establish that with the method developers again. So a method developer will know immediately if they have the testing volume to start an in-house laboratory. But yeah, I would work with regulators and method vendors to start beginning their testing journeys.
And now, given recent concerns about avian flu in the poultry industry, and I've written about this a fair amount, what measures can the food industry take to better protect global food supplies and reduce waste?
Yes, so I'm not a virologist, and this is well out of my realm of expertise. However, we do have people at Neogen that are staying up with the bird flu trends. And while the bird flu has the ability to affect people, agencies worldwide, such as the USDA, Animal, Plant, and Health Inspection Service, work to control the virus so that it does not threaten human health. And these agencies do this through routine inspection and, if necessary, depopulation of infected flocks, as well as they quarantine the infected birds until there's no visible signs of illness. So
aside from avian flu, I guess with the rise of other foodborne illnesses, what are some preventative testing strategies that food companies should prioritize to mitigate these risks? And are there any best practices that you would recommend for companies looking to enhance the safety and sustainability of their supply chains?
Starting from the very beginning, requesting C of A's from raw material suppliers to ensure that they have met all of their quality standards, testing raw materials once they receive them, monitoring their critical control points throughout their processing to understand if anything went wrong during the process. When I work with food processors that are experiencing like a contamination event or spoilage organisms in their finished product, it's often due to those three things that I just listed: a raw material coming in overly contaminated, something in their environment. Usually if it's environmental, it's either to inadequate cleaning or it's due to something new, like a construction in the building, introducing new environmental risks that weren't a risk to their process previously. Otherwise, it's a failed critical control point or like a machinery malfunction, right? So they're not reaching the correct temperature that they should be achieving to kill the organisms in their product. And so there are measures that they can take to make sure that they're monitoring each of the steps throughout their process, basically.
And how does Neogen how are they able to stay ahead of emerging food safety threats and continuously adapt their testing solutions to meet the industry's evolving needs?
Working directly with customers is the best way to stay ahead of emerging threats. Understanding, their needs and what they're going through and challenges that they need to overcome. The closer you are to the customer, I feel like the more innovative it allows us to be. We also have a global team of technical experts that allows us to stay up to date with changes that we have worldwide and to maintain relationships to help us stay up to date on emerging needs. Make sure that we make innovative testing solutions that meet their needs, making sure that we talk to customers and get their feedback to understand their needs and challenges, making sure that we make innovating testing solutions that meet the needs of what customers are doing and what they are required to do, and making sure that these testing solutions ultimately meet best practice.
Now, looking ahead 5 to 10 years, what are some key trends or areas of focus you think will shape the future of food safety testing?
Digitizing laboratory data and automation in a food lab is going to shape the future of food safety testing. There's a lot of human error that occurs in a laboratory method and record keeping. And so to remove that human error and have everything automated, I think will really revolutionize the food safety testing technology. And it's also really exciting that we are looking into ways to automate these traditional auger methods and these old school microbiology methods. And now it's becoming completely automated. So I think there's more to come and there's a lot more progress that needs to be made. And I also am really interested in seeing the changes in food, right? There's a lot of new innovative foods that are coming into the market. We're looking at cell-based meats, everything plant-based now, it seems like. And so I think there's a lot of new risks and new development that will need to be implemented to accommodate these new foods that are entering the markets.
Right. And along with these new foods, obviously has to come new regulatory changes and laws. So how do these, new regulatory changes impact food safety testing? And how does Neogen sort of adapt to these changes?
As we advance in food safety and food testing, regulations are also advancing. And one of the things that I've seen changing is all of the testing was evolved on how we used to define foods, but the definition of foods is growing and is changing. And the example that I gave earlier, for instance, cell-based meats and all of these new age food, plant-based products, they don't necessarily fall in what these standards have defined as foods, right? They don't fall into vegetables or produce or meats or these very generic food groups that we've established or that ISO and AOAC have identified. And so more and more we're getting calls on, what does my food fall under the scope? Or how do I test this food if it's 70% guar or something that we've never even heard of before. And I think that regulations are going to have to change to accommodate these new foods that are entering the food industry. So I think that's one way that that food regulations are evolving.
And I got one last question for you. So how important is consumer awareness and education in food safety? And does Neogen play a role sort of in promoting this awareness?
With my experience in the food industry, there are things that I just refuse to eat. And I think every consumer should have that awareness as well. Just because there are risks involved in all the foods that we eat. And I also think that it goes both ways, right? So I think there's an impression that consumers have that the foods that we eat should be sterile, and that's not the case. We need to be eating bacteria in order for a healthy gut, a healthy microbiota. We would not survive if we were eating only sterile foods. And so there has to be an understanding from the consumer standpoint that it's not a realistic approach to have sterile foods or foods with no bacteria. It's understanding what's normal and setting specifications around what's normal, and also educating our consumers that it might result in spoilage of the product. It might result in a shortened shelf life of the product, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a food safety risk. It's more of a food spoilage risk.
Well, Annie, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure to be here today.
All right. Well, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Food Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, and see you next week. Bye.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.